Kia ora level 3 students, welcome back. Today we're going to look at allocative efficiency, or 91399, demonstrate understanding of the efficiency of market equilibrium. Let's get into question 1. Indirect tax and elasticity of demand. The purpose of the indirect tax, such as an excise duty, is to discourage consumption of goods that may have negative health or social impacts and to generate revenue for the government. Graph 1 shows the effect of an indirect tax placed on a good with inelastic demand, and graph 2 shows the effect of a tax placed on a good with elastic demand. We can see the steep curve here versus the shallow curve here, and then we've got to calculate the decrease in consumer surplus, decrease in producer surplus, increase in tax revenue, and the deadweight loss. So let's flick over to our graph on our slides here and talk about it. So first, the difference between the price that the consumers were willing to pay, the demand curve, and the price PE is our original equilibrium, is our original consumer surplus. So it's shown in green here, it goes all the way off the graph. The original producer surplus is the difference between the price that they received and the price the producers were willing to receive, the supply curve. So this blue triangle. And then on the other side, the triangles are in the same place. You'll just notice that the consumer surplus triangle is a lot smaller because at these early values, the amount they're willing to receive, at these early values, the amount they're willing to pay is much less in the elastic demand as the inelastic demand. So this triangle is much smaller and the producer surplus is the exact same. However, when we add in the tax, there's a new price for consumers. Instead of consumers paying PE, they actually pay P1. And instead of receiving goods QE, they receive goods Q1. For producers, they also lose a little bit as they receive a lower price and they sell a lower quantity. Same on this graph. Consumers are paying a higher price, receiving a lower quantity, and producers are receiving a lower price and selling a lower quantity. Where does that difference go, or that change go? It goes into tax revenue in gold here, and then the little bit of deadweight loss, and that's the same on the other graph. So we can see here the decrease in surplus. It was down here. Now it goes all the way up to here, and we lose P1A, B, PE. And for producer surplus, we're losing PEB, P3C. On this side, we were down here, but we lose PE, FE, P2. And for producers, we were here. Now we go down, so we lose PEF, P4G. And it looks like this. Some of the area lost is gained in tax revenue from the government. So P1A, C, P3 is gained by the government. But this area ABC is lost and doesn't get transferred to anywhere. Or the area EFG is lost as well. And in both those cases, that becomes the deadweight loss. It's the area of surplus not transferred when the government has intervened in the market. So let's just rehash these answers here. And we can see it's P1, A, B, PE for decrease in consumer surplus. Decrease in producer surplus, PE, B, C, P3. Tax revenue is the rectangle of P1, A, C, P3. Or in this case, P2, E, G, P4. And then the difference, ABC is the deadweight loss in graph 1. And EFG is the deadweight loss in graph 2. And then explain the impact on consumer surplus and why it's greater when the demand is inelastic compared to when it's elastic. Include a definition of inelastic demand and a reason for demand being inelastic. So the tax decreases consumer surplus in both cases. Referring to the graph, so you might use the actual values that we've established up here. So it's decreased it by this amount and this amount. This is because they buy less units at a higher price. So they've decreased the surplus per unit and they've decreased the units from which to gain a surplus. However, the loss is greater in graph 1. The change is greater because the same amount of tax results in a smaller decrease in quantity. Right? So that means that the change in quantity is smaller here. The change in quantity is larger here. However, there's only a few units lost here, right? There's only a few units of consumer surplus lost by selling less units, much less than, if we read the second part, this means less units from which to gain a surplus, but the large change in price for consumers as the incidence of tax falls on them. So if we look at the change in price, they're paying from PE to P1. This rectangle of this rectangle of P1, A, and then the point in the middle here that's not referenced, and PE, is much larger than the area of P2, E, the dot that's not referenced, and PE. So the incidence of the tax has a much greater effect. The increase in the price the consumers have to pay has a greater impact on consumer surplus than the small decrease in quantity caused by the increase in price. So that's why the inelastic demand has a great, the change in, or the tax has a greater impact on consumer surplus on the graph with the inelastic demands. They might pay a higher price for the good as the good is inelastic. For example, the good might be a necessity such as milk, and the consumer cannot substitute for other products, that should say. For example, the good might be a necessity such as milk, and the consumer cannot substitute for other products. Then part 2, explain whether the government would place the indirect tax on an inelastic or elastic good if the objective was to generate revenue or discourage consumption. So let's have a look on our graphs here and think about the two examples. So if we were aiming to generate revenue, then we would want to see the value of the tax, so $2 or whatever the value of the tax is. If we were aiming to generate revenue, we would aim to see the value of the tax be larger. So in this case, both of the tax values are the same, or the quantity be greater. So we can see in graph 1, the quantity Q1 is close to QE, where quantity 2 is further away than QE. So if the aim is to generate revenue which is tax times quantity, if the quantity is larger, the quantity sold is larger, and the inelastic demand, that's going to generate more revenue. So we would choose inelastic demand if the aim was to generate revenue. However, the aim could also be, or the question's asking us, what if the aim was to reduce consumption? Well, the same principles apply. If we were looking to reduce consumption, the elastic demand would have the better option, as the increase in price causes a more than proportional response in quantity demanded, and therefore the QE to Q2 distance is greater and there's less consumption. So perhaps if this was a demerit goods that the consumers need to consume less of, then the elastic demand would be the correct option to choose there. Question 2. Although New Zealand generally aims for a free trade and open trade environment with relatively low tariff, some goods like textiles and clothing continue to be subject to tariff to protect domestic industries. Graph 3 shows the New Zealand market for textiles and clothing. On graph 3, show the effect of imposing a tariff by indicating with dotted lines the new quantity demanded and supplied, and then the new surpluses and the deadweight loss. So I've already done it here. So this is our original consumer surplus in green, producer surplus in blue, and then after there's our change. So our new QD is this line here, our new QS is this line here, and our new price here at PW1. So what happens to consumer surplus? It decreases as we sell less units or we buy less. Our consumer surplus decreases as we buy less units and pay a higher price. The producer surplus increases as we sell more units and receive a higher price. The government revenue increases as we import the smaller amount of imports, but each import must pay the value of the tariff, which is the difference between PW1 and PW. And then the area that was surplus that's not transferred, so if we look here, our greens, this was surplus. Some of it's gone to producer surplus, some of it's gone to government revenue, but these two triangles don't go anywhere. Those become our deadweight loss. Refer to graph 3, the resource material and the changes you made on page 6 in your answer. Explain the impact of the tariff on the market for textiles clothing on the following: the consumers. We know the structure here. We go price, we go quantity, we go overall. So for consumers, they are paying a higher price. They are receiving a lower quantity as QD decreases from Q2 to QD. Therefore, overall, there's a decrease in consumer surplus. The price has gone up, which makes them unhappy. The quantity has gone down, which makes them unhappy. Overall, let's put a Q there. Overall, they are unhappy. Producers, including the difference in the impact for New Zealand producers of textiles and clothing importers of textiles. So let's make this a bit smaller. So let's make those two sides. So we've got the group 1 here, and then group 2, which is the importers. And so group 1, they're receiving a higher price. So the price they're receiving is increasing, which makes them happy. The quantity is increasing. They're selling more goods, so that's increasing. So they're also happy. We'll see this over here. They're selling a higher price at PW1, and they're selling more at QS. So overall, the producers of textiles are happy. They've got more surplus. However, the producers that import textiles, they almost act as consumers here. They're going to have to pay the tariff. So they're going to be worse off, but not due to the surplus. It's because their costs of production are going to increase. Costs of production are going to increase, and that would increase their Okay, the government is the next group. The government, they were receiving no tax revenue. Now they are receiving tax revenue. So if we think about revenue or spending, the revenue is increasing. That's making them better off. And then we've got to think about their goal. What was the aim of the government? What was the government's goal? What was the aim of the government or the government's goal? Let's have a little look. It was to protect domestic industries here, And have we protected the domestic industry? Well, yes, because now the domestic industry receives a higher price and they sell a greater quantity, so they're better off, and the government has achieved their goal. They're happy. So there's 2 wins here for the government. These guys are for sure better off. Allocative efficiency. Now, it's the same kind of sentences we're looking for each time here, which is, are the total of the consumer and producer surplus maximized? Is there a deadweight loss present? And then is the market allocatively efficient? And then, of course, we've already stated that the decrease in the consumer surplus is not offset by the increase in producer surplus and government revenue. Some of the area lost is not transferred, and this is the deadweight loss. Therefore, surpluses are not maximized, and there is a deadweight loss present, which means the market is now not allocatively efficient, and we're worse off. But not allocatively efficient is what we're looking for. Graph 3, or question 3, a subsidy plays an important role in improving New Zealanders' access to affordable and effective medicines. Without a subsidy, the market for medicine is likely to face a shortage. So graph 4 indicates the market for medicines. On graph 4, use dotted lines to show the resulting shortage. So we know we're going to draw our lines down here, and then label the difference between these two, the shortage, because this is our QD, where the price meets the demand curve, and this is our QS, where the price meets the supply curve. At the current price, how would equilibrium be restored in the market for medicines? In your answer, refer to relevant labels on graph 4. Here we go. At the original price of P1, that's always where we're going to start, at the original price of P1 here. And then what's the market situation? There is a shortage because the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. Who cares about a shortage? if a business is selling out of their product, they don't really care because they're selling all the product that they want. It's the people queuing up outside that care, or it's the customers that care when there's a shortage. So the consumers will respond by bidding up the price. You need to say bidding up the price, and then why are they doing that? They're doing that to access the shortage. They're bidding up the price to access the shortage. How do the producers and consumers act after that? As the price increases, the quantity supplied increases because the product's now more affordable, or the medicine is now more affordable. So therefore, producers will increase QS, and at the same time, the quantity demanded will decrease as the product becomes less affordable. This will continue until equilibrium is restored at PEQE. Better health outcomes for New Zealand would now mean less cost pressure on the health system in the long term. This is a good justification for the government to continue funding subsidy for medicines. On graph 4, add one new curve to show how the effect of a subsidy and how it would remove the shortage from the market. So let's do that to start. We're going to add a curve right in like this. I'm going to call it S plus sub. And shade and label the area that represents the total cost to the government. Show the price producers receive, and then mark the area representing the deadweight loss to ABC. So we might get a little bit messy here. Let's try zoom in so we can make sure we get it clean. So the subsidy, what I like to remember is at the second equilibrium, there's two prices. So at the first equilibrium, PE, QE. At the second equilibrium, which is P1, QD, there's actually a second price up here at the original supply curve, and that looks like that. This becomes my P producer. This becomes my P consumer. And then the area and then this area here becomes my dead weight loss. And then this area here becomes my government spending. Government spending is this area. And then my dead weight loss is the area of surplus, or the area of surplus not transferred. So the government spends all this. This area, in fact, let me use a different color pen here. This area here becomes an increase in producer surplus. This area here becomes an increase in consumer surplus as they receive as they pay a lower price, and demand curve remains the same. And then so finally, this area here this area here will be my deadweight loss. So it's the difference. It's the area of spending that's not transferred to consumer or producer surplus. Here's my deadweight loss, the area not transferred to consumer or producer surplus. So let's quickly read the question here. Explain the impact of the subsidy on the market for medicines on the following. Consumers, the price they pay has decreased. The price that they pay has decreased. So therefore they are increasing their surplus per units. The quantity that they receive has increased. Therefore, there's more units from which to get a surplus. So overall, there's an increase in consumer surplus for producers, for consumers. For producers, the price that they receive has increased. Therefore, they are gaining more surplus on each unit sold. The quantity has increased. Therefore, there's more units from which to gain a surplus. So overall, they are increasing their producer surplus. And then refer to the graph, so from PE to PP or from QE to Q1. The government, including how it justifies funding. So we want to know, for the government, we want to know, have they achieved their goals? And do they have to spend or do they get revenue? In this case of the subsidy, we know it's government spending, which is a negative for them. But their goal is achieved because they're increasing the number of medicines applied or the number of medicines consumed. And medicine reduces their spending in the long run. So let's have a look at the government goals. Yes, the government goal is achieved. And then there is some short-term spending, so short run, negative. But if we remember the question up here, it says there's better outcomes in the long term, so there's less cost pressure in the long term. So in the long run, they're actually better off as well. So overall, much better off. The last one, allocative efficiency. The sum of the surpluses is not maximised. The deadweight loss is present, and so the market therefore is not allocatively efficient because there is a deadweight loss. Some of the surpluses is not maximised. The spending by the government is not transferred fully into consumer surplus or producer surplus. That's all of us today. Thank you very much. Leave a comments with any questions or suggesting on the paper for me to do. I'll try to do one a day from now on, and I'll see you in the next one.